You've heard me talk about running a few times on this podcast, but today you're going to meet arguably the most qualified runner I've ever had the opportunity to speak with. This individual has set world records. This individual has coached thousands of people. He's been interviewed by the number one podcaster in the world, but that's not why you should listen to him. You should listen to this individual because he's proven, because he's done the work, because he loves what he does, and he wants to inspire others to do it. Please welcome none other than Mr. Zach Bitter. How are you today, sir?
Good. Thanks for having me on, Jonathan. Looking forward to chatting.
Likewise, I've followed the journey. I have an idea of how accomplished you are. We're going to educate the audience a bit. I mentioned at the top that you've held a world record, but it's actually 2 world records, if I'm not mistaken. Can you tell us a bit about what records you have held and where you're at currently?
Yeah. So the nice thing about the 100-mile record is that if you get it, there's some incentive to stay out there and keep running, because there's also a record that they base around the 12-hour time frame where you just see how far you can go in 12 hours. So in 2019, I broke the world record for 100 miles. I ran 11 hours, 19 minutes, and 13 seconds, and then stuck around for another just under 41 minutes and got up to 104.88 miles for the 12-hour. So that ended up being 2 world records in kind of one race. But yeah, it's kind of maybe a unique thing to ultramarathoning where you can double dip a little bit there if things line up the right way.
What happens to your ego after something like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I found that it wasn't something too crazy for me because I've been really fortunate with my running success in general, where the way I like to describe it is I've sort of been able to grow within it at like a really local way early on by just competing in like small meets and things like that in the middle school and high school age type frame. And I was also never like top tier at all these stages between middle school, high school, and college with the more traditional distances. So by the time I got into ultramarathon running, I had very much fall in love with the sport of running, and at most of the points of my running career I had been just something where I was like, okay, this is a hobby, not a job, not a profession. And then when I first really started having success as an ultra runner and decided that the world record was something I wanted to try to chase after, it ended up taking me almost 6 years to get to the point where I ran that race. So I think my relationship with that sort of an accomplishment had changed to a degree where it was much more about kind of finding the end to the path that a runner will go on when they decide they want to try to find what their highest potential is, or walk away from the sport someday thinking, okay, if I never run faster than that, and that's where it ends for me, then I got to the end of that road. That I think is where my mind was more kind of located after that race. And I mean, that's where it continues to be, even though I do think I can run faster. But you have to prove that. And to some degree, it's just like trying to do it and not succeeding at doing it could just showcase at this point, to me anyway, that, that was the fastest I could do. And I didn't leave any stone unturned trying to do it better than that. But that was just the pinnacle of the fastest I could go in 100 miles, the furthest I could go in 12 hours. And to me, I think that's part of the joy of that, outside of just kind of the feeling of accomplishment, or that I ran faster than anyone else had before, or kind of any of the things that would typically draw like kind of a inflated ego from something like that.
I could take this a couple different ways. I think the first direction I want to take it, I've heard you talk about where your mind goes in a 100-mile race, but what I'm curious about is how you define mental strength. Let's start there.
Yeah, I think mental strength is more about how are you able to continue to focus when you've gotten to a point of like discomfort or self-doubt. Like, how do you navigate that? So the races I've been when I've had races that have been where I've been really mentally on it and been able to feel like I was strong right up through the finish, it's kind of an interesting experience, because you typically in those type of races end up pushing through barriers that you hadn't gotten through before. So on one side, it's kind of cool because it's like, okay, became more mentally strong. I was able to stay resilient and not cave when I normally would have conceded and slowed down or accepted a lower tier goal or something like that. But then you also have to like kind of reflect upon like, well, why didn't I do that earlier? Was that something, did I need to not be able to do that earlier? Is that a process where you get a little further each time, or over the course of years, maybe you get a few opportunities to kind of break through a little bit further and then redefine kind of where that limit is for you? But yeah, mental strength, I think, is something where it's an endless process of trying to build upon what you've done in the past and redefine kind of how far you can push yourself versus it being something like how stubborn can I be or something like that in the heat of the moment if I'm trying to get somewhere that I want to get to and it's getting difficult.
It's funny because that whole idea of how you can stay focused once the discomfort sets in is so important to focus on, because I think something that gets lost a lot when it comes to winning is the chaos that comes along with it. You see it in team sports, especially over sustained periods of time. You look at the 90s Bulls, or you look at the 2000s Lakers, like how much turmoil internally those teams face. The Dallas Cowboys, how much turmoil they experienced. And even in a runner's mind, right? Like, you've won races, you've set world records. And I can imagine that I know from my own personal experience, the full gamut of emotions that I personally experienced running 50 plus miles, like, you question your life, and then all of a sudden you're running at this unbelievable pace that you didn't even know was physically possible when you were just feeling like your worst ever like 20 minutes earlier. It's this crazy dynamic where like you're the same person but you're not the same person. When did you realize you had this skill of being able to run for hours and days?
Yeah, that was definitely a process of kind of learning that too. I guess maybe the first sign I didn't know it at the time was when I was in college. I really did gravitate towards the long run that we would do weekly. And that was by far my favorite workout and the one I looked forward to the most. So maybe there was some signs there that just that sort of like style of training or that sort of state of being, I guess, was maybe a little more something that I was interested in exploring to its conclusion to some degree when you get into ultra marathon, I guess. But yeah, after college, I started just running higher volume too, and that was sort of when I got maybe a little more curious about doing an ultra marathon, and then I did one, and then that kind of spiraled into doing more of them. So it really was kind of learning as I went along, though. Like even when I did my first few ultra marathons, it wasn't something where it was like, oh, I found the sport that or the version of running that I'm better at than I am at any other distance, or can develop at a better way than other ones. It still took a lot of opportunities to kind of really figure out where I landed within kind of the space of competitive ultra marathon running versus like what I would be able to do in say like a 5K or a 10K. So I think like maybe when I really started thinking like I should take this seriously, and not that I wasn't taking it seriously before, but think of it as like this might be something I should explore as a career or something to build a career around, was around 2013 when I did my first kind of track ultra marathon. And there I broke the 100-mile American record and the 12-hour world record. And that sort of kind of signaled to me at that time, it's like, okay, there's this aspect of the sport that I was very unfamiliar with up until fairly recently at that time that I was quite good at, and should continue to pursue that. And that kind of led me towards the career path I ended up going on. So that was probably the biggest signal right there.
In those down moments of a race, even though you see all this success through training and through, well, when you can reflect on it, you can call it success. I imagine in the process, you see it a little bit differently, and you could educate us on that. But there's a lot of lawyers and high performers that listen to this show. And a large focus that we draw attention to is, how do we overcome the hardest things that we've ever been through? How do we manage our suffering? How do we deal with burnout? How do we manage our stress? In 100-mile races, in training for something like that, going for something as audacious as a world record, how have you navigated the moments of doubt, insecurity, overtraining, undertraining, or just questioning your reality?
Yeah, I like to look at any of these sort of things as like there are going to be times where you want to zoom in and there's going to be times where you want to zoom out. So if it's something where I have a bad race, it's very easy to try to zoom in on that and hyper focus on, well, what went wrong that day, which you do want to do to some degree. You want to make sure you're not leaving opportunities to learn on the table. So unpacking all that stuff is important. But then ultimately you want to zoom out and look at just like, well, what was I doing to prepare for this race? And where was the development that's pretty objective, that has more than just one day as an example of evidence for it? Then start kind of deciding what to do next in terms of trying to get yourself back to where you wanted to get during that event, and what changes you maybe want to make versus what is worth kind of keeping around or staying the course on. It's not something that's necessarily easy to do in the sense that you get it right all the time. But I think if you do zoom out enough and collect enough data on your running and kind of your progress and things like that, and where the needle's been moving on different performance metrics and things like that, you can you just a little more trust in the process, at least on the training side. And then also just being aware of areas where there's potential for improvement. So like the world of ultramarathon is pretty, I wouldn't say unique like this, but it's maybe different than a lot of the big sports where we're still learning a lot about what works best in ultramarathon. Like we have position statements and kind of approaches, but they're not based on mountains of evidence the way that there would be for some of the bigger sports. So it's like, what areas am I like more confident in that I need to kind of make foundational and not be too, or be a little more rigid about making sure I stay the course on, or what things that I can maybe pull back from and play around with a little bit or adjust and try differently, because we have multiple options that could be potential tools to do a better job with that. And then just generally continuing to kind of like keep your awareness about the sport as it develops too, so that when new things do come out and new innovations and things appear, you're ready to kind of explore those and take advantage of them when there's enough evidence for them to use as a tool to try to get faster.
And practically speaking, even for the process, like how have you so you're saying that the zoom in, zoom out strategy is something that you've leveraged to help you kind of maintain a level head. Is there anything else or any other tools that you lean on to help you manage your mindset when you're going through the process?
One thing I like too is like establishing like the purpose of doing things and being honest with yourself is really helpful here, because for me, I mean, I would prefer a really good race. I would prefer to go out and knock it out of the park, but I I know that's not the reason I'm doing it. Like, because if that were the reason I was doing it, then I would have probably stopped running much earlier in my life, because I wouldn't have had those sort of opportunities necessarily to really express or reach for that stuff. So some of it is just, what are you doing in your training to motivate you to kind of keep wanting to do it and do more? So for me, that's just like, I love the development process of starting from like the beginning of a training block or a training cycle and organizing the parts, and then doing the progress monitoring, the assessments on, like, use a program called Training Peaks, where you can go in and dive into like the GPX files that come off of your watch and see all sorts of different things around heart rate, training load, just your paces at certain intensities and things like that. And just kind of have like that plan in place to follow and test and kind of study as you see what's working and what's maybe not working as well. So I think kind of falling in love with that process that can be day to day is really important, because then you're going to be drawing that motivation when there's maybe not as much incentive to feel motivated if the race is further off.
What about during the race, when that doubt sets in, when that insecurity sets in, if it ever even has, those negative moments? How do you navigate the internal conversation? How do you navigate any of the obstacles that you face during a race?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always try to go, the first thing I'll do is I will kind of separate myself from what was likely going to be the biggest driver of that self-doubt, which is oftentimes thinking too far ahead. So like if I hit like a rough patch, say at like mile 36, and I start thinking, okay, this isn't feeling great right now, I should feel better than this. The next thing my mind is going to do is it's going to be like, yeah, you're only at 36 miles. You got 64 more to go. You feel bad now. You think 64 miles is going to feel great. And then that starts to spiral. You got to stop that as quickly as possible. So what I like to do in that point is, first I'll zoom in and think like, okay, let's forget about 64 miles. Let's get back on pace and just focus on getting this next mile done. So now my target became small and approachable and digestible. And then while I'm doing that, I'll also be thinking kind of more on the macro to try to make in the back of my mind that 64 miles that is still sitting back there. I haven't forgotten that that's there, but I'm trying to not like fixate on it. But what I'm attaching that to is how small that actually is compared to the months that I did spend preparing for the race itself. So you kind of have this internal conversation with yourself of like, oh, bailing out at 36 miles when you had 64 left doesn't seem like a bad decision if you're not feeling good because 64 miles feels big in that comparison. But bailing out at 36 miles and you have 64 miles to go when you did, maybe 1,000 miles running going into that race during just the peaking development phase, or you think about like the months that you spent, the hours you spent. Like for me, it's like, a good quality training week when I'm in peak form is going to get up to 20 hours when you add in the running, the strength work, the cycling, the accessory work, and the mobility and all that stuff. So like, it's like, do I really want to just say like, all that stuff we'll save that for later? Or do I try to express what I did there now when I have the opportunity right in front of me? And those sort of things tend to help me a lot when I can sort of zoom in for the short term and with respects to like, I need something I can wrap my head around right now, but then also zoom out to the totality of everything I did other than the race to try to make that 64 miles or whatever, wherever that low happens to be and what's remaining, kind of feel a lot smaller than maybe it does in the moment.
It's such a powerful strategy to take, like the zoom in, zoom out, zoom in, create relativity approach, because I always have this mindset of, let the work talk. Like if you did the work is going to show. And I'll just give like a brief running resume of my own next to a world record holder. Let's see how this holds up. A few marathons under my belt, ranging from like 3:42 to 3 hours. And, I was telling you before we hopped on that I had missed it by like 40 seconds, which was so frustrating. But in September, a year ago, I ran a 58-mile ultramarathon and raised a bunch of money for a cause near and dear to my heart. And then without any real training plan, I do a 318 at New York 8 weeks later. And it was just like 7-8 mile runs and a random 20-miler, like with my baby. I would have been happy with the 330, but I guess my zone 2 cardio across like all that other running set me up nice for a 318. And I was like, well, I wonder if I like was very emotional after. I was like, I didn't even know I had that in me. And then I was like, what if I did train? What if I did hire a coach? What if I did invest? Like, could I break a sub 3? And this is coming from someone who, like, in 2020 couldn't even run. Like, I had a terrible back injury. I was like, I don't even know if this is possible. And I ended up running my first marathon after like learning about breath work, posture restoration, and long story long, I end up missing it on 70 days notice. I hire a coach. I sign up for Toronto and I do a 3-hour, 39-second marathon. And so now I'm going through it for the second time, trying to break 3 hours next weekend in Chicago. And, my hips, my knees, like I've hit my paces, but like my hydration is kind of off. Like it's easy for me to get into my head. But, I know I've run over 1,500 miles this year alone. And, what you're talking about here is really going to help me create some relativity in the down moments where it's like, I know I've done something like this before. I've put in the work, like I'm going to let the work talk, but like, let's take this one step at a time. I really think that's something that running teaches you alone. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think you're thinking about it the right way too. And then now you're armed with experiences that you did not have before that too. So one thing I like to do is when you do have a race, whether it's a good race where you maybe just missed a goal where like, man, you're thinking if I could have just been less than a minute faster, I have a 2 in front of my marathon PR time. That is going to be in your mind and it's going to be a motivator. And as you're kind of like, as self-doubt maybe creeps in the hours before the race or in the early stage of the race while you're still trying to stay comfortable, and you can remind yourself, hey, I did 318 off much less training than this. So this is sustainable. I've proven this is sustainable. So then that sort of stuff is really powerful in kind of keeping that that noise a little calmer and keeping your your mental battery a little more fresh for when you're really going to want to exhaust it in that end stages of the race. I really like that kind of self-reflecting on those stuff and really kind of going in with a bit of a list of things that you can kind of pull from. The other thing I really like too is when you're out doing your training is take time, especially on the race specific run. So if you're doing like a long run with any goal marathon pace in it, or just any run will work for this, that's just the most specific of them, is visualize you being on part of that course and like executing what you want to do. What I have found is with these races that we can't do like loads of them because they're long, they're exhausting, they're tiring, the training is tedious, or not tedious, but just demanding. It helps to have reference points that are closer than the last time you did it to be able to have your mind go to and sort of go on cruise control with. So for races where I've had a better time kind of cognitively, I have like a bunch of runs that I did leading into that where I had basically said, okay, I'm at this point on the race, maybe it's 70 miles. I'm just going to visualize during this run what it's going to be like to go from 70 to the finish, or 70 to 90, or whatever it happens to be. And it's amazing how that sticks in your mind as like a reference point. And then when you do get to those stages in the race, you feel like you've done dress rehearsals and you feel more prepared mentally because you've sort of done, you haven't now just done the physical reps, but you've also done the mental reps. And that connection point is real on race day.
The visualization aspect is so key. I've been weirdly visualizing Chicago all year, and I'd only really signed up a couple months ago, but at the back of my mind, I had this possibility, like what if? Like what if? I'm 180 pounds now. I was like 185 at the beginning of the year, 190-ish, but like it just shows you what's possible when, you're thinking big enough. And a big part of life is that a lot of us don't think big enough. Like you went out and you set a record in a 100-mile race. That's insane. Like you had the audacity to believe in yourself. As much as you may have thought it was a given, it's still an audacious thing to do. I mean, just from all the pushback that you get from the general population around like, whoa, your knees are going to I mean, I know what I get. I can imagine what you get. What's some of the pushback that you get from people when you talk about what you do?
Yeah, I mean, you get all of that. The different like, oh, it's terrible for your body, it's unhealthy, stuff like that. I would say I don't get as much negative stuff as I think people maybe assume I would, but it's always there. There's always somebody who's kind of self-loathing to some degree, and they want to try to make themselves feel better by justifying what they're doing or not doing in some cases, and let you know about it. But yeah, I mean, it's nothing too like unique, I would say. It's probably pretty similar to what you're getting with respect to just kind of like, like how running is bad for you, or you should do more strength work or something like that. Or the one that I do get a kick out is people will reference like how running or cardio isn't healthy. First of all, it is. But even if I wanted to kind of grant them what they're assuming, which is just that runners go out and just plod around at a really slow pace all the time, that is healthy. There, you can argue about the quantity side of things and the approach you take in doing so, and how gradually you progress and where you stop and all that stuff. But generally speaking, it's always kind of laughable to me because when I look at like a well-structured endurance training plan, it has strength work, it has speed work, it's got short intervals, long intervals, it's got a ton of variety in it. And yeah, you're doing quite a bit of long, slow running, but it's not void of some of these things that they're considering like maybe a little bit better of an option. And it's just kind of a funny exchange at that point. And I always use a reference here because there's always like some race going on that's like the Olympic level type stuff, or like recently World Athletics went on and they had like the men's 1500, and the Cole Hawker, the guy who won gold in the 5,000, his final 100 meters for the 5,000 was like, I think just over 12 seconds. So it's like chances are the person online who's telling me that like I should be sprinting versus running is nowhere near running a 12-second 100-meter. So it's like, well, here's this distance runner who can do it. So so clearly like the program from distance running can produce fast running. But yeah, stuff like that usually I think is kind of where people will go, is they'll have whatever kind of fitness thing that they like to do. And for some reason, they feel like they have to defend that and make it seem like it's a superiority one where, my general take is like, if someone doesn't like ultra marathon running, you probably shouldn't do ultra marathons. Or if you don't like powerlifting, you probably shouldn't do powerlifting. We've just got so many great options to move your body and stay fit and healthy that it's like, you may as well pick one that you're enjoyed and you're motivated by. So, yeah, that's the,
I think, I mean, you're 100% right. Like, that's kind of where I have just learned to make peace with the reality that I'm not here to be understood. And running has taught me so much about myself and what I'm capable of, and opened up a whole world of possibility where I realized, like, first time I ever went over 30 miles was on a whim. I just like expected to do 15, and I just kept running. And I didn't break, and I'd never been calmer. I'd never like, and you're getting all these demons out too, like teachers from when I was in like the third grade are like popping up in my head, like when like all these random things about people that didn't think I could do this, that, or the other. Like as I'm running up a hill 27 miles into this random run that I decided to do on a whim, like not properly fueled, not properly hydrated, and like having a full day afterwards. And this isn't a testament to Jonathan Cohen or my fitness or anything like that. I'm quite literally on a podcast with a 100-mile ultramarathon world record holder. Like there's no comparison here. It's simply like the metric and the measure of what showing yourself what you can do when you go beyond a certain distance or beyond whatever cap you've put on your potential. Like running is just that metaphor I have found for life that allows you to go beyond the limit and the scope that you see yourself living within. What does running mean to you?
yeah, I know that's a great point. What I always think about is like my favorite type of runner is the person who has a big goal that is aggressive enough where there's a chance they're not going to get it. But it's not so aggressive that it's like, okay, it'd be like, oh, I want to run a 2 hour and 25-second marathon and break Kiptum's world record. Okay, that's probably not going to happen. It's an aggressive goal, but it's probably not doable. But, so something that kind of threads that needle a little bit about being aggressive enough where it's a challenge, but realistic enough where it's like, oh yeah, there's some signs that would say if you do all the right things, if you follow the process properly, then you could get there. And then they are able to sort of step back and say, okay, so that is the goal, the end goal, one of the big goals. But it's going to take me more than just one training cycle to do that. It's going to maybe take multiple training cycles. Or in the case of like the marathon, in a lot of cases, this might take years and years to get to that. And they're able to sort of appreciate, okay, well, where's the next stage? And then where's the stage after that? And then where's the stage after that? And really just stay within that process, all while having that big end goal kind of still in the back of their mind and to some degree motivating them along the way. I just think that's such a unique thing. You'd think it'd be more common because it sort of makes sense from just a realistic scaffolding standpoint, but it's so easy to get impatient when we're talking about not just days, weeks, and months, but years, to think like, oh, well, maybe I'll try to take a bigger jump. Maybe I'll force the issue here. And in running, it's about doing enough, not too much, not too little. So if you over predict where you're trying to get to, and I've made this mistake, so this is probably why I appreciate this type of runner when they do it right, is like, I was like, okay, cool. Like they didn't make that same mistake. It is when you're kind of structuring your workouts and what you need to do to achieve that next step in the goal. If it's too aggressive, you're going to be training outside of the right targets for a huge chunk of that training build. And that's just going to yield probably a step backwards or an injury or burnout fatigue. And the likelihood of someone kind of giving up on their end goal early because they try to skip a step in the more developmental step stage of it. So like when I think about running, I think about that because I think that's just going to be the type of runner that is going to eventually, whether they get that goal or not, that they originally set on the table as like, here's that end stretch goal for me. It almost doesn't matter because that person's going to find their max potential. And whether it's at, behind, or ahead of that original target they put on the board, it doesn't matter. That target, all that really symbols is it's something that they can aspire to in order to make sure they get to the end of that road and walk away from it the way that I feel like I'll be able to it someday with the 100 mile and say like, okay, that was my max potential. Let's go, or I could be proud of that. That whole thing was worthwhile then versus why was I wasting my time doing that versus something else?
What keeps you going? What are you chasing now?
Yeah, I've got a couple 100 milers coming up actually. One in just less than 4 weeks. It's a less than 2 mile, really flat, kind of controlled loop up in Des Moines, Iowa. And that's going to be one where I run a few new things that I've been working on. And I'm in a pretty good spot right now from just a relative fitness for running a fast 100 mile. So I think I've got an opportunity to run a pretty strong 100 miler into the 11-hour range. But I've also got one that's going to be maybe a little faster course or a little faster venue at end of December that I'm also kind of training for at the same time. And that's one where I think like if I have a chance to run a PR this year and go under that 11:19 that I ran as my fastest, that would be a spot that would be doable at.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Inside the Inspired. My name is Jonathan Cohen, and I have a quick favor to ask you. If you're getting any value out of this content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. You help us reach more people, and you can also stay up to date with all the latest content coming your way. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll catch you in the episode. How have you sustained the recovery, the performance? Does it get overwhelming? What's that process like for you?
Yeah. The recovery is a really interesting one and a good one to think about because it is something where like if you have a good race or a promising race that makes you think, okay, I really want to get back to another race and try again or take another swing. You got to be mindful of not just the race itself, but all the cumulative load that you did to get ready for that race. So, I like to look at the recovery process through mind and body. The body, I need to be physically ready to kind of get back. And that's usually just a couple of weeks before I can usually get back up to full kind of training capacity, or at least on the path towards that, where the structure's back and I'm heading in that direction. The mind is the one that I think is a little more tricky because you have to kind of separate yourself from maybe the honeymoon period after that last race and really ask yourself, remember that those workouts that you just really struggled with in that last block, are you ready to tackle those ones again? Because they're going to be there. They may not be the same workout, but there's going to be some in that next training cycle where you're like, afterwards, you're just like, oh my gosh, why am I doing this? This is terrible. You got to be motivated and ready to take those on. So being clear that your mind is ready and willing to kind of go to those levels again in a sustainable way is kind of the other area that I tend to look at when it comes to recovery.
When you see all these backyard ultras like the BPN ultra like we just saw, what do you think of this movement? Where do you see the future of ultra running going?
Yeah, the ultra running has been such a fun sport to be in professionally and as a coach because it's been growing so much in the last 10 years. And to some degree, it's finding its roots or it's finding elements of it that had been popular historically. So like ultra running feels like a new sport, but it's really a very old sport. There were ultra marathons in the 1700s. In fact, there's all sorts of like history with like 6-day events, these multi-day events where you see how far you can get in 6 days, where at one point they were so popular they would fill Madison Square Garden or the building that is now Madison Square Garden with spectators that would go in there and bet on them and just like watch these crazy people go around this loop for 6 days. It was, the sport was big back then. So this more recent kind of surge is sort of going maybe a little bit a different direction where I think the trails and the mountain stuff got really popular fast. And that's the one where a lot of people are fixated on in terms of like the sport being more mainstream. But as we see that grow out, we're also seeing kind of this reignited interest in just like, oh, it doesn't have to just be like a single day ultra marathon, like a 50 mile or 100 mile in some cases. It can be these longer type things. And we're seeing more like interest getting into things like these last man standing competitions, which are now getting pushed up to almost 5 days. The 6-day records have gotten broken recently, which had stood for a very, very long time. We're seeing just like more kind of 200 or 300 mile races on the trails pop up now. So it's it's just like the sport is kind of continuing to like refine the expansiveness that it had offered in the past and can continue to offer when people show enough interest in certain types of events and then people get motivated to create them.
You've had the opportunity to sit with hundreds of high performers and professionals talking about ultra running, mental performance, life. Steve Magnus, Nick Bear, list goes on. Just two of them off the top of my head. How has your podcast, Human Performance Outliers podcast, informed your training, your life, and what kind of role does it play for you now?
Yeah, yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I mean, it's the podcast itself has evolved a lot in sense of like where the focus is on it and stuff like that. But it's just been something where I've used it kind of as a platform to explore interests that I have, whether it be like nutrition, fitness. I've been definitely skewing it more towards ultra marathon and running type stuff. I'm finding kind of bringing on guests in that world, and then also using it as like a bit of a spot where I can kind of educate runners who are getting into the sport or new runners in general too. We just got so many new runners, regardless of whether they're doing ultra marathons or not, that are just interested in getting better at things, and they don't have that background knowledge like I did, where I had coaches in high school and college and around me in my life to help me kind of figure out the answers to some of the harder questions or even the easy questions in some cases. So like it's always sort of been this platform for me to kind of like explore stuff and then bring on guests that can help me do that or shed light on certain things I'm interested in. And I really like that as kind of like a compass for it too, is just like, what am I interested in? What do I want to explore more about and learn more about and kind of steer it that direction. So that I think has been a kind of nice little like break for me in terms of like, it's not something that I really do and am burdened by just like whatever like thing happened on the running workout or the race I just did. It kind of gives me another avenue to explore and do things that are independent of whether I'm running well or not. So, you get injured and you can't run for a month or something like that. It's like if you're just running, then it can be really kind of depressing and demoralizing to be like, okay, now what do I do? And you're left kind of like wallowing in your own sorrow, so to speak. But when you have these other things that are maybe not unspecific, but different and still require attention and require motivation and require you to exercise the skills that you actually developed through training and racing. I think that's really good to have. And I think the podcast and coaching for that matter have both really kind of given me those opportunities, whether it be helping other runners kind of figure out their path or their training, or on the podcast talking to people about different topics and exploring different kind of avenues of training, racing, nutrition, fitness, and all the stuff that we've done on there.
Yeah, you've had some really, really incredible guests in and outside of the ultra running world. I mean, I'll just geek out for a second. Maybe you could share one or two gems of wisdom that you got from Cameron Haynes, Nick Bear.
Yeah, Cam was a lot of fun, and maybe it's a little recency bias with that one because he just came on not too long ago. But I really like Cam's just approach to how he sort of looks at his interests and things like that. So he has, he's got an interest outside of ultra running, but he uses ultra running to really support that interest. But at the same time, he's not making a lot of compromises in terms of like what he expects from himself from that. So it's not just like, oh, well, I'll go and I can just like kind of half-ass this run or this race because really at the end of the day, it's a means to an end to make me a better backcountry bow hunter. He's very much invested in getting everything out of himself, even though maybe at times it's a means to an end for that sort of stuff. So talking to people like that too, who are really interested in developing themselves in something that they're not the absolute best at. And I mean, Cam's a very good ultra marathon runner, but you won't see him standing on the top of the podium at Western States or, see some of these big trail races. But, he's a world-class bow hunter and he may be standing on the top of, whatever the archery podiums they have. I don't know enough about that world other than that he's like one of the top guys in it. So I really love it when people that have really kind of pushed themselves to like a world-class level in something, then also turn and take interest in the sport of running and ultra running. And then at the same time, guys like Camp bring in a whole new type of person that would have otherwise maybe not explored the sport because now they're using him as their kind of like entry point or their point of reference of, oh, well, if a guy who's focused on archery and bow hunting and generally looks more like I wouldn't say he looks more like a strength athlete, but he doesn't like he doesn't look like the starting line of the Olympic marathon, which can be a little bit daunting to somebody maybe who's coming from a strength background and wondering, well, could I ever run 100 miles? And then they see someone like Cam Hanes, or I've used David Goggins as an example for this in the past too. These are guys that came from other fitness worlds into ultra marathon running. The number of people who now all of a sudden believe they can do it too is a lot higher because they've got big signal boosts and they are what they're walking examples of that. So I really love that about just like kind of his personality. So it was really fun to kind of talk to him. Yeah, Nick Bear's a really interesting one too, just because again, kind of a similar scenario where he's basically told like millions and millions of people why choose. And I love that because like kind of like we were talking about before, it's like why pigeonhole yourself into one thing if you're legitimately interested in kind of just health and fitness. And yeah, you maybe want to perform to the best of your ability in the moment, but maybe not at the compromise of your deadlift or maybe not at the compromise of other kind of goals you have from a health and fitness standpoint. So you kind of explore a lot of different stuff. And I find that to be kind of a lot more like what we had as kids when we'd go out for recess, where it was like, yeah, maybe it's basketball season and we're going to play basketball a lot, or maybe it's baseball season and we're going to play baseball or football or whatever. It's like we did it all. And we never really thought twice about the fact that, doing one maybe would be a compromise of us getting better at the other. It was just what's going to be fun, what's going to be enjoyable, what's going to be motivating now. And I think that sort of style of athlete or runner or person is just a really interesting type of person who's basically said like, yeah, why limit ourselves here? Let's do as much stuff as we can and have fun with it.
That to me is like the epitome of everything we just talked about. Someone is whoever it is, whatever influencer, whatever role model, whatever person introduced you to this concept of it's possible for you too. For me, it was David Goggins. I mean, a lot of guys that I know from, like, I know you interviewed Matthew Johnson also. He was also on the podcast right before he did the run across Texas. I remember when I was interviewing him, I was training for my 58-mile ultra and he was training to run across a state. And his whole mindset was, yeah, I just can't think 50 miles is like a long distance anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, I get that. It is, but I get it. And it's just so funny because in my general vicinity, like saying a marathon is still a very long distance. And it is a long distance. My body feels it, especially when training at high intensities. I mean, you train at high intensities for even crazier durations. But like, it's not that, I don't know, I guess I'll ask you, do you think it's that certain bodies are built for ultra running or running in general relative to other bodies, or can you build that running body, if you will?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's gonna be some variance here. So if you get like here's where I look at it. Like when you get a sport that has a lot of competitive pressure. So most Olympic sports, because that kind of incentivizes people to go after that sort of sport to the degree where you get pretty high competitive pressure. You are gonna oftentimes at that pinnacle of the sport get a very specific body type or a range within like a little bit more of a narrow range of types of bodies that kind of fit a little bit more of a descriptor. But as you kind of step away from the heavy selection that is required to say run a world-class marathon and just start looking at like at the individual level, what is going to produce the fastest time for me, that's where you're going to get a lot more variance. So like if I find someone who's 6'5", 250 pounds, really fit and lean, I'm not going to get them down to 125 pounds, and I'm certainly not going to get them down to 5'10". So it's just one of those things where it's like, that's an extreme example, obviously, but there is a degree of limitation based on just your own genetics. So genetics is going to select for some portion of your potential to get to some of those very top tier spots in certain sports. Ultra running thing, I think we have a lot wider variety of that, and maybe that's because ultra running is got a bigger window of types of bodies that are going to be able to move quickly through these longer races because of some sort of like durability component where there's so many variables there where if the strengths and weaknesses can be different enough amongst runners, and as long as you have enough of them line up well for you to be able to run fast, you'll see it. I do suspect, though, over time, if the sport gets more popular and more competitive pressure comes in, we'll see that narrow in terms of what we typically see kind of the athlete look like that's winning some of the bigger races out there. But there's probably gonna be a lot of range within the sport because the sport itself has a lot of diverse types of activities between 50 Ks up in the mountains, 6 days on flat tracks, 100 milers with 30 plus thousand feet of climbing and descending. So, those all may produce a different type of like optimal sort of physique in order to be on the top of a podium. But yeah, generally for listeners, I think like it tends to be kind of a bad path to go down to compare like what do I need to look like to be a good runner? Because what an individual needs to look like to be their best runner may be quite a bit different than what they see on TV or what they see at the Olympics or at the top of a podium on an ultra marathon or things like that. So I think it probably creates more problems than solutions when people try to chase that sort of aesthetic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. I mean, we're seeing it now a bit with Truett Haynes, went from like big broad dude to like now he's still big broad, but he's trying to go sub 230 and you can go from 180. I think he's like in the 150s now. And that's just kind of what it does. I mean, like I was in the 190-ish range a couple of years ago. I did like 1,000+ pull-ups in 4 hours, again, raising money for a cause that I care about. And thank you. And, just kind of that cross training reference. And, I was way too heavy for that, but nonetheless, I was able to get it done. Not as pretty as I would like, but was able to get it done. And then fast forward, like now I'm in the 180. Sometimes I'm under 180. And like, it's just kind of naturally bit. My legs have definitely lost some muscle, but
Yeah.
like, there's nothing that can replace that morning run feeling or even after the run feeling, man. It's just one of those things that has given me so much clarity. I think running will always be part of the arsenal. We'll see if distance running continues to keep up after this, but I definitely think there's something to be said for like the ultra marathon and the marathon, like what it has done for me. I don't know if my body's built for it. It's a question that I wrestle with quite a lot because I love to lift. I love to run far. I don't have all day. So it's like kind of this I'm forced to choose kind of thing. And when I go too far down one rabbit hole or the other, or I over index on one, obviously the other has to suffer. So I go through seasons of it. But I think that's just the nature of things. And I know you've worked with hundreds and thousands of people at this point. I know that your coaching has shown people some incredible success in both the marathon and ultra marathon. How can people keep up with your journey? Where can they find you based on all the sage advice that you've offered us today and a lens into the mindset of a world record holder? How can people get in touch with you around your coaching, your speaking, and keep up with the podcast?
Yeah. The best spot to kind of find everything I'm up to is my website, which is just zachbitter.com. I've got links to the podcast, coaching, my social media channels, and all that sort of stuff. So that's usually the easiest spot to if you want to play around and figure out what I'm up to everywhere. In terms of social media, I'm probably the most active on Instagram, which is just at zachbitter. And then the podcast is just Human Performance Outliers Podcast with Zach Bitter.
There's a question that I pose to every guest that comes on the pod. Now I'm going to pose it to you. If the future version of yourself from 10 years from now were to fly in and offer you some advice in order to get there, what do you think he would say to you?
He's going to probably tell me to really slow down and appreciate the next few years, because from just a potential at some of the distances I focused on so far in ultramarathoning, that's realistically probably my timeline to still explore optimization and my fastest potential running time.
That's part of it, though. That's the exercise, right? Being able to look forward and understand, like, appreciate this process, know where you're at, appreciate where you're going. Zach, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you sharing everything that you did today. You definitely gave me some stuff to think about. What can I say, legend? Good luck on your upcoming races. And if you got any value out of this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe to Inside the Inspired. This was Zach Bitter. This was Inside the Inspired. My name is Jonathan Cohen. I'll see you on the next one.